Gina balanced the large gift box against her hip and smiled as she stepped into her sister's backyard. Pink and white balloons floated above perfectly decorated tables, guests laughed over sparkling drinks, and someone called out, "Melissa, your sister's here." Melissa glanced over, gave a quick nod, then looked back to the guests surrounding her. After spending weeks helping plan the shower, Gina assumed she'd simply find her name card and sit down. Instead, she searched every decorated table twice. Finally, she spotted a single handwritten place card resting on a folding chair inside the open garage. The chair sat beside stacked storage bins, a lawn mower, and several dusty paint cans. She carried the card back toward the patio. "Melissa," Gina asked quietly, "I think someone made a mistake." Melissa barely looked at it before shrugging. "No mistake." Gina blinked. "My seat is in the garage." Melissa folded her arms. "The tables are full. There are empty chairs right there. They're saved." "For who?" Melissa gave a dismissive smile. "Be grateful you got a seat." The nearby conversation faded. Several relatives had clearly heard every word. Not one of them said anything. Gina looked from her sister to their parents. Both avoided eye contact. She stood there for one long second, then quietly turned around, walked to the gift table, picked up the beautifully wrapped present she had spent days choosing, smiled politely at the nearest guest, and headed for the driveway. Behind her, someone whispered, "Is she really leaving?" No one stopped her. By the time Gina pulled away from the curb, the baby shower continued as though nothing had happened. No one there realized the celebration was already beginning to unravel. The invitation had promised a celebration of new beginnings. For Gina, it ended the moment she saw that lonely folding chair in the garage. What made the humiliation sting wasn't simply being separated from everyone else. It was knowing Melissa had planned it. Every place card had been neatly handwritten. Every table had been carefully arranged. Nothing about that seating assignment was accidental. As she drove, Gina replayed Melissa's words. "Be grateful you got a seat." They echoed louder than the music that had been playing in the backyard. She had spent 3 weekends helping assemble decorations. She had picked up supplies after work. She had coordinated vendors when Melissa became overwhelmed. She'd smiled through every request because, to her, family helped family. When she finally reached the main road, Gina let out a slow breath. "I don't have to stay where I'm not wanted," she said quietly to herself. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She simply kept driving. Back at the shower, a few guests noticed the missing gift on the present table. "Didn't Gina bring a really big box?" one cousin asked. Melissa waved dismissively. "She took it." Someone laughed awkwardly. "Well, that's uncomfortable." Their mother quickly tried changing the subject. "Let's play the next game." But the mood had shifted. Instead of gathering around Melissa, several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Then phones began vibrating across the patio. One after another. Melissa checked hers. The confidence vanished from her face almost instantly. She stared at the screen. Her complexion turned pale. The smile she'd been wearing all afternoon disappeared. The celebration around her seemed to stop as everyone noticed something was suddenly very, very wrong. Melissa continued staring at her phone long after the notification appeared. The chatter around the patio faded as a cousin leaned over. "Melissa, is everything okay?" She locked the screen almost immediately. "It's nothing." But it clearly wasn't. Across the yard, 2 guests quietly asked, "Where did Gina go?" "She left." "Why?" Melissa answered before anyone else could. "She overreacted. I offered her a seat, and she decided to make a scene." An awkward silence followed. A few people glanced toward the open garage, where the lone folding chair still sat beside cardboard boxes. Meanwhile, Gina drove without turning on the radio. Her hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, but memories kept surfacing. This wasn't the first time she'd swallowed an insult to keep peace in the family. She remembered giving up holidays because Melissa wanted to host. She remembered apologizing after arguments she hadn't started because their parents always insisted, "You're the older sister. Be the bigger person." This time, something felt different. The garage chair hadn't been an accident or a thoughtless oversight. It had been a message. At a red light, Gina's phone buzzed. Her friend Denise had sent a text. "I saw where they put you. Are you okay?" Gina looked at the message for a moment before replying. "I'm okay. I just decided it was better to leave than argue in front of everyone." A few seconds later, Denise answered, "You didn't deserve that." Back at the shower, Melissa tried to pull everyone's attention back to the games. "Come on, everybody. Let's not ruin today." An older aunt quietly spoke up. "Melissa, Gina spent weeks helping with this shower." Several guests nodded. "I saw her picking up decorations." "And she was here late last night setting everything up," another guest added. Melissa forced a laugh. "She's always making herself look like a martyr." The words landed poorly. People who had been smiling only minutes earlier now exchanged uneasy looks instead. For the first time that afternoon, Melissa realized fewer people were agreeing with her. Then her aunt asked the question no one else had wanted to say aloud. "If Gina did so much for you, why did you put the one person who helped you most out in the garage?" The question hung over the backyard longer than anyone expected. No one reached for another party game. No one opened another gift. Instead, every conversation circled back to Gina's empty place. Melissa crossed her arms and forced a smile. Everyone needs to stop acting like she's the victim. A family friend frowned. "Then explain it." Melissa looked around the patio before answering. "Gina has always been jealous when attention isn't on her. She does this at every family event." Several guests exchanged confused looks. "I've known Gina for years," one of Melissa's coworkers said. "I've never seen her act that way." Another guest nodded. "Neither have I." The room grew noticeably quieter. Then Melissa's mother's longtime friend cleared her throat. "I wasn't going to mention this, but maybe people should know." Every head turned toward her. When Melissa was worried about going over budget for the shower, Gina quietly paid some of the vendor costs herself. Melissa's eyes widened. "That's not." "I was standing there when she handed over her card," the woman continued. "She specifically asked the vendor not to tell anyone." A murmur spread through the guests. Someone whispered, "She paid for this." Another added, "And she ended up sitting in the garage." Melissa's parents shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Trying to regain control, Melissa spoke more firmly. "You don't understand. She betrayed me first." The backyard fell silent again. "What do you mean?" an uncle asked. Melissa took a slow breath. "I found out she'd been telling people about my financial problems. That's why I didn't want her sitting with everyone." Several guests immediately looked at one another. "I never heard anything from Gina," one cousin said. "Neither did I," another replied. "In fact," Denise added, "Gina wouldn't even tell me how stressed Melissa was. She kept saying it wasn't her story to share." The explanation Melissa had relied on suddenly sounded much less convincing. A couple quietly gathered their things and excused themselves. "This doesn't feel like much of a celebration anymore," one of them admitted. Melissa watched as they walked toward the driveway. Then, from near the back of the patio, a voice cut through the silence. Everyone can stop guessing. An older relative stepped forward, holding up a phone. "I know exactly where that rumor really started." The backyard went completely still. Every pair of eyes shifted toward the older relative holding the phone. Melissa swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" The relative unlocked the screen and said, "Before anyone says another word, I think everyone should see this." She opened an old family group chat and another thread saved on her phone. "Months ago, Carol called me after overhearing part of a conversation about Melissa struggling with bills. She assumed everyone already knew and started asking if I could help. She looked directly at Melissa. Gina wasn't even part of these conversations. Carol, Melissa's aunt, immediately shook her head. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. But you repeated something private, another guest replied. The relative continued scrolling. These messages are dated weeks before the shower planning even started. One by one, several guests spoke up. Carol mentioned it to me. I heard it from her too. So did I. Not a single person named Gina. Melissa stared at the screen, her face draining of color. I thought, she whispered. Their father finally broke his silence. You never asked Gina if it was true. Melissa couldn't answer. Then the event coordinator, who had stayed behind to finish packing decorations, walked over. I probably shouldn't interrupt, she said carefully, but since everyone's talking about the budget. She handed Melissa a folder. These are the final invoices. Inside were payment confirmations. Several balances had already been marked ** paid. The coordinator pointed to the receipts. Your sister covered these after we called about the remaining amount. She told us not to mention it because she didn't want to embarrass you. The realization hit Melissa all at once. The sister she had isolated in the garage. The sister she had accused without proof. Had quietly protected both her finances and her reputation. Melissa pulled out her phone and called Gina. Straight to voicemail. She called again. No answer. A third time. Nothing. Ignoring everyone around her, Melissa grabbed her purse and hurried toward the driveway. I have to fix this, she said, almost to herself. Less than 30 minutes later, she stood outside Gina's front door, staring at it without knocking. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered into the quiet evening. I made the biggest mistake of my life. Melissa stood on Gina's front porch for nearly a full minute before she finally knocked. The door opened slowly. Gina looked surprised to see her, but not angry. What are you doing here? She asked calmly. Melissa struggled to find the words. I was wrong. Gina stepped aside without speaking, and Melissa walked in. For several seconds, neither of them said anything. Finally, Melissa looked down. I believed someone who told me you were spreading my financial problems around the family. Gina's expression barely changed. You could have asked me, I know. But instead, you decided the garage was where I belonged. Melissa covered her face. I thought I was protecting myself. Gina quietly shook her head. The chair wasn't the worst part. Melissa looked up. The worst part was realizing my own sister believed I deserved to be treated that way. The words landed harder than any argument could have. Melissa's shoulders slumped. I don't expect you to forgive me today. Gina walked to a desk drawer and pulled out a small folder. I wasn't planning to show anyone these. She handed it over. Inside were receipts, payment confirmations, and emails from vendors. When Melissa's shower budget had fallen short, Gina had quietly paid several outstanding balances herself after the vendors contacted her. Each receipt showed the same thing. Paid by Gina. No request for reimbursement. No note asking for credit. Melissa stared at the paperwork in disbelief. You covered all of this. I knew you were stressed, Gina replied. I didn't want your shower falling apart over a few unpaid invoices. You never told me. I wasn't helping so people would praise me. At that moment, another knock sounded at the door. Their parents had followed Melissa over. When they entered, they immediately sensed the weight of the conversation. Melissa handed the folder to their father. He slowly flipped through the receipts before looking at Gina. You did all this. Gina nodded once. Their mother sat down quietly. We should have spoken up today, she admitted. When Melissa said what she did, we stayed silent. Their father sighed. And we've expected you to be the one keeping peace for years. No one argued. There wasn't anything left to deny. The next morning, Melissa contacted every guest who had attended the shower. She didn't make excuses. She admitted she had publicly humiliated Gina based on an accusation she never verified. She apologized for embarrassing her sister and for allowing false assumptions to shape her actions. The relative who had repeated the original rumor also apologized to the family, acknowledging that careless gossip had started the misunderstanding. From then on, relatives treated anything they heard secondhand with far more caution, and that relatives' credibility suffered because of the role they had played. For Gina, one decision changed everything. She stopped automatically organizing family celebrations. She stopped paying unexpected bills without being asked. Most importantly, she stopped believing that keeping the peace required sacrificing her own dignity. At first, Melissa struggled without the quiet support she had always taken for granted. Planning family events, managing expenses, and asking for help directly forced her to appreciate what Gina had contributed for years without recognition. Over the following months, the sisters met occasionally for coffee. The conversations were honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but different from before. Melissa listened instead of assuming. Gina spoke up instead of staying silent. Trust didn't return overnight. It was rebuilt through consistent actions rather than promises. Relatives also began treating Gina differently. Instead of overlooking her contributions, they included her in family decisions and thanked her openly for what she did. The balance within the family slowly shifted. Melissa eventually understood that the greatest damage hadn't come from believing a false rumor. It came from choosing public humiliation over a private conversation with her own sister. And Gina realized something just as important. Walking away from that garage chair hadn't ended a relationship. It had ended a pattern. Gina left because of a chair in the garage, but what truly changed that day was that she finally stopped accepting a place where she never should have been seated.